My name's Claire. I've been a registered nurse for over 15 years, and I've worked in every corner of the hospital from surgical floors to the ER. But some nights, no matter how many years you've put in, the building feels different. There are things you can explain, and then there are things you don't even try to put into words. This is one of those nights. It was a slammed shift. Every room was full, and when that happens, we line patients up in the hallway. Stretchers, IV poles, monitors buzzing away, curtain dividers giving what little privacy they can. You get used to the soundscape of it, call lights, footsteps, beeping, the low moans of people who just want to go home. That night, I was assigned to the East Wing hallway stretchers. 5 patients, all lined up, all waiting for beds that never seemed to open. One of them was Mr. J, an older man, mid-70s, thin, frail but alert. He wasn't confused, wasn't on heavy medication, just tired and short of breath from heart failure. When I did my first check, he seemed calm. Vitals weren't great, but nothing that made me sound an alarm. I charted, adjusted his oxygen, and moved on. It was about an hour later when he caught my attention. I walked by and he reached out, his hand trembling, catching my sleeve. "Nurse," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Could you move the man in the next bed?" I glanced down the hall. There was no next bed, just an empty space, a supply cart, and then the next stretcher a good 10 feet away. "There's no one there, Mr. J," I told him, gently. He frowned, shook his head. No, you don't see him? He's right there, standing by the bed, staring. I've heard patients say things before, shadows, whispers, family who weren't there. Hallucinations can come with fever, infection, even exhaustion. So I reassured him, checked his vitals again, and stayed a little longer by his side. Eventually he nodded, as if satisfied I was at least listening, but 20 minutes later he called me again, same request. "Please, move him, I can't rest with him there." This time his voice carried more fear, like he wasn't just uncomfortable, he was unsettled to his core. I stood there looking at the empty space. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the air conditioner kicked on, and all I could hear was the steady rhythm of his heart monitor. But his eyes were locked on that stretch of tile, wide and unblinking. I told him I'd take care of it. I even walked over to the space, adjusted the supply cart, moved it a few feet, just to give him some peace of mind. He watched me closely, then let out a slow exhale. For a little while he calmed down. Hours passed. The hallway grew quieter as the night deepened. The usual chaos dulled into that eerie hospital stillness. Lights dimmed, voices lowered. I did my rounds, checked fluids, pushed meds, reassured families who looked as worn out as their loved ones. When I returned to Mr. J, he was restless again. His fingers were gripping the sheets, his chest rising and falling too fast. He pointed once more, his hand shaking. "He's back, the man in the next bed. Why won't you move him?" By then, his monitor was showing more stress. His oxygen saturation dipped. I paged the resident, made adjustments, tried to keep him comfortable, but his gaze never left that space. He kept whispering, "He's waiting, he's waiting." Not long after, it happened. His alarms went off, flat, urgent beeps. His body arched once, then collapsed back into the stretcher. We rushed in, the team flooding the hallway. Compressions started, meds were pushed, the crash cart slammed open. I counted compressions, sweat stinging my eyes, voices echoing down the empty corridor. But he never came back. Time of death was called in that same hallway, under the same dim lights, with that same empty space beside him. When the paperwork was finished and the stretcher was covered, I had a moment to breathe. I stood there staring at that stretch of tile he'd been so fixated on. I told myself it was nothing. Low oxygen, failing heart, the mind playing tricks in its final hours. But I'll tell you the truth. Standing there in that silence after the code, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been seeing something the rest of us couldn't. And I never forgot the way he kept repeating it, almost begging me, "Move the man in the next bed." There was never another bed there, just him, and maybe, just maybe, someone waiting for him. My name's Emily, and I've been a registered nurse for a little over a decade. I've seen plenty trauma cases, late-night codes, patients coming in alone and leaving with their families by their side. Hospitals are strange places in the dark hours. They don't sleep, but they do change. The day shift feels alive and buzzing with activity. The night shift, well, that's when you notice the quiet things, and sometimes it's in that quiet that the stories you don't forget begin. That night, I was covering a med-surg floor. Nothing unusual about the shift, steady, but manageable. A few post-op patients, some with infections, a couple on oxygen. I knew every room, every patient, every family member who had come and gone that day. Visiting hours end at 8 p.m. sharp. Security makes rounds, doors lock, and visitors need approval for exceptions. We don't bend those rules lightly, especially at night. It was around midnight when I walked into room 214. The patient was a middle-aged man recovering from abdominal surgery. He'd been stable all evening, resting quietly. No complaints, no family at bedside. I checked his IV, adjusted the flow, and started documenting on the computer workstation parked in the corner. That's when I noticed it, sitting right there on the overbed tray table. A bright yellow visitor pass. The kind we hand out at the front desk. Plastic-coated, dated, stamped with the hospital logo. I froze for a second, because I knew, with absolute certainty, that patient hadn't had any visitors all evening. I'd been in and out of that room. I'd charted him multiple times. There was never anyone else in there. I picked up the badge. It felt real in my hand. Cool plastic, the adhesive backing slightly worn, like it had been peeled off someone's shirt. The date was that very day. The timestamp, 9:32 p.m. But that made no sense. Visiting hours had already been over for more than an hour when it was supposedly issued. I stepped out and went straight to the nurse's station. I showed the badge to the charge nurse, and she looked at me the same way I must have looked at the tray. We called down to security. They pulled the visitor logs. Every person who checks in has to show ID and be logged into the system. They read the names to us. Not a single one matched the patient in room 24. In fact, no one had checked in for him that entire day. I asked if maybe the front desk had made a mistake. Security swore there was no record. No pass printed for that room. No exceptions granted. So then I asked the obvious question. If this pass wasn't issued, then whose is it? The guard just said that shouldn't exist. I went back to the patient. He was still asleep, calm, completely unaware. I didn't tell him what I'd found. There was no point in spooking him. But I checked the room top to bottom, bathroom, closet, corners, under the bed. Nothing. No sign anyone else had been in there. The badge was the only trace. I set it aside in a plastic evidence bag, logged it like we would any odd finding. That's policy. You document, you file, you don't speculate. But here's the part that stuck with me. When I walked back in an hour later to do vitals, the patient stirred. He blinked at me and said, "Groggy, my brother was here earlier, sat right there by the bed, didn't say much, just watched me for a while." I froze, because I'd read his chart. He didn't have a brother listed in his emergency contacts. In fact, his family notes specifically said no next of kin available. I asked, carefully, what did he look like? The patient thought for a second. Then he said, "Kinda looked like me but older. Same eyes, just quieter. He left before you came back." And then he drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I turned in that visitor pass to security. They scanned it, logged it, checked the barcode. No match in the system. It was like it had been printed for someone who didn't exist. The patient never brought up his brother again. And by the following day, he was transferred to another unit. But that pass, it stayed in my mind. Because we track everything in hospitals. Who enters, who exits, what time, what date. You don't just get a pass without a record. There's no such thing as a visitor without a name. And yet that night, there was. To this day I can still see it in my hand, that yellow visitor badge, stamped with a time and a date that should have been impossible. And I still wonder who, or what, was sitting by that bedside. I've been a registered nurse for about 12 years now. I've worked ICU, telemetry, and med-surg. You learn fast that hospitals run on documentation. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. Every med, every assessment, every note has to be there. That paper trail is what keeps patients safe, and it's what keeps us accountable. So when you start losing documentation, it's not just strange, it's terrifying. It started on an ordinary evening shift. I was caring for a man in his 60s, recovering from pneumonia but complicated by heart failure. He wasn't in terrible shape, oxygen, antibiotics, steady monitoring, but not out of the woods either. I went through my usual routine. At the bedside clipboard, I wrote out the progress notes. Vitals stable, meds given, lungs diminished but improving. Handwritten, initialed, clipped right back onto the board at the foot of his bed. Standard. I stepped out to check on another patient, maybe 20 minutes. When I came back, the clipboard was there, but my notes weren't. Just a blank sheet. I thought maybe I'd absent-mindedly carried it with me, so I retraced my steps, checked the nurse's station, checked my pockets. Nothing. I sighed, rewrote the notes, and clipped them back. 2 hours later, I returned to chart again, and I swear, once again the progress note sheet was gone. This time I felt the panic creep in. Misplacing paperwork is a big deal. I asked my coworker, but nobody had touched it. Charge nurse swore she hadn't removed anything. Housekeeping hadn't been in. We checked the trash, the med cart, the computer desk. Nothing. I rewrote the notes for the second time, clipped them back, and told myself maybe I was just distracted. By the third night, I was uneasy. I walked into the room, did my assessment, and carefully wrote the notes again. I even pressed hard with the pen, making sure my initials stood out. I clipped the sheet, gave it a little tug to be certain it was secure, and left. When I came back less than an hour later, the sheet was gone again. Not torn, not on the floor, just gone. The clipboard looked like no one had touched it. Fresh, empty, waiting for me to write again. I stood there for a long time, staring, the sounds of monitors and hallway voices buzzing behind me. My patient was resting, unaware, while I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. On the fourth night, I walked in already tense. I decided not to write at the bedside. Instead, I jotted the notes on a separate sheet at the nurse's station, intending to attach them later. But before I even had the chance, his alarm went off. Cardiac monitor flatlined. We rushed in. Code Blue called overhead. Compressions started. Meds flying. Airway secured. It was chaos, the kind of chaos you know all too well in this line of work. But he never came back. Time of death was called at 2:14 a.m. Afterward, when I finally clipped the final death note to his chart, I couldn't help but think of those missing sheets. 3 times I'd written his progress notes. 3 times they vanished. It didn't feel like an accident. It felt like something was erasing his record, piece by piece, as if his story was being pulled away before it was finished. And when the fourth night came, the night there were no notes left to vanish, his life ended too. I filed the incident. Security searched. Housekeeping tore through bins. Risk management even interviewed me. But no one could explain it, and I still can't. I've documented thousands of patients. My handwriting fills entire binders of charts. But this man, his record is blank where those notes should be, like he was already slipping away before we ever lost him. To this day, I can still see that empty clipboard, cold metal clip gleaming under the fluorescent lights, holding nothing at all, and I wonder if some patients take their story with them. My name's Laura. I've been a registered nurse for just over 13 years, and I've spent most of those years on a busy medical floor. You get used to routines, protocols, and double checks. If there's one thing hospitals take seriously, it's patient identification. That little wristband around the arm, it's sacred. It carries a patient's name, date of birth, medical record number, and it connects them to every single order in the system. You don't give meds, blood, or even water without confirming it. So when that system fails, or looks like it fails, you feel it in your gut. It was a midweek night shift, steady but not overwhelming. I had 7 patients, all needing different levels of care. Around 10:45 p.m., I rolled my med cart down the hall to Mr. H's room. He was in his late 60s, admitted for pneumonia with complications from COPD. He was alert, oriented, and even joked with me earlier that evening about hospital food. I pulled up his chart on the scanner, prepped the meds, and as always, went to scan his wristband. That's when it happened. The scanner beeped, then flashed a red warning across the screen. Patient deceased. I froze, my heart skipped. I scanned again, thinking maybe it was just an angle issue. Same red error. Patient deceased. I looked down at the band on his wrist. Full name, date of birth, medical record number. Everything matched. It was his, and yet according to the system, I was trying to medicate a dead man. I excused myself quickly, trying not to show my face. At the nurse's station, I pulled up his chart on the main computer. Everything looked normal. Active status, current orders, nothing suggesting a problem. No one had coded him. No physician had written anything about death. I called IT support. The guy on the other end sounded confused. He ran a check and told me, that shouldn't be possible. If the system flags deceased, it's because the record has been closed. But your patient's chart is still open. I asked, so why did it scan that way? He just said, glitch, maybe, try reprinting the band. I brought a new wristband from the printer, double-checked all the identifiers, and carefully swapped it out. The new one scanned fine. Problem solved, at least technically. But here's the part I can't shake. When I went back to give the meds, Mr. H was quieter than usual. He asked me what the holdup had been, and I brushed it off, told him the computer was being slow. He looked me straight in the eye and said, that's okay, I don't think I'll be needing them much longer anyway. I laughed it off nervously, but something in the way he said it made my stomach turn. Hours later, near the end of the shift, his call light went off. When I walked in, I knew instantly something was wrong. He was pale, gasping, eyes unfocused. Within seconds, his alarms erupted. We called a code, started compressions, pushed meds, did everything by the book. The room filled with staff, but nothing we did made a difference. At 4:12 a.m., the physician called time of death, and just like that, the man the computer had flagged hours earlier as deceased was gone. The next day, I pulled the IT report. They found no evidence of a system error, no duplicate charts, no false death entry. According to the record, nothing had ever been wrong, but I'll never forget the feeling of that scanner in my hand, flashing red, insisting he was already gone when I knew he was still alive, talking, breathing. I've worked countless shifts since then, scanned thousands of wristbands, but every time that beep sounds, I still think back to Mr. H, and I still wonder if that first band wasn't broken at all, if it was simply telling me something I didn't want to believe. My name's Caroline. I've been a nurse for over 15 years, most of them in palliative care. If you've never worked that field, let me tell you, end-of-life care is unlike anything else in nursing. It's not about saving a life, it's about dignity, comfort, and being present in moments when families often can't. You expect silence in those rooms, maybe soft prayers, whispered conversations, the hum of oxygen. But one night we all heard something we couldn't explain. It was late, close to 2 a.m. The halls were dim, the unit unusually calm. I had 3 patients actively declining, one of them a woman in her 80s who'd been with us for nearly 2 weeks. She was frail, barely responsive, and her family had gone home just a few hours earlier to rest. Her room was simple, no television, no radio, no personal electronics. We keep things quiet so patients can rest. The only sound had been the steady rhythm of her oxygen concentrator. I was finishing rounds when I heard it. A faint melody. Soft, slow, unmistakable, a lullaby. At first I thought someone had left a phone playing. I checked my pocket, then the computer at the nurse's station. Nothing. The sound was coming from her room. I stepped inside, careful not to wake her if she was still resting. The melody grew clearer. Gentle notes, almost like a music box playing down a hallway. The patient's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, but the music, it seemed to drift around her bed, filling the air. I checked the nightstand. Nothing. I unplugged the wall clock, thinking maybe it had some chime I'd never noticed. Still, the song continued. I even checked the bathroom, the drawers, under the bed. Nothing. The hair on my arms lifted because it didn't sound like music from an object. It sounded like music in the room itself. I stepped back into the hallway and asked another nurse to come listen. She tilted her head, her eyes widening. "You hear that too?" she whispered. Within minutes, 2 more staff came. Each one stood there, listening in silence. All of us heard it. A lullaby, low, delicate, like a mother humming a child to sleep. We checked the rooms on either side. One patient was asleep. The other had no devices running. No TVs, no phones, no visitors. And yet the song continued. We stood there for what felt like a long time, though it was probably just minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the lullaby faded. One note at a time, softer and softer, until it was gone completely. We were left with the hum of the oxygen machine and the shallow sound of the woman's breathing. I went to her bedside, held her hand. Her pulse was faint, irregular. I stayed there, charting her decline, whispering softly so she wouldn't be alone. Less than an hour later, she passed. Peacefully, quietly, her chest rising one last time, before going still. Afterward, when I stepped out, the other nurses looked at me with the same uneasy expression I must have had. None of us mentioned the music in our official notes. What would we even write? But all of us knew what we'd heard. In a place where machines beep and alarms ring endlessly, that night we heard something different, something softer. And I've often wondered if that lullaby was for her. A final comfort none of us could have given, but that somehow found its way to her bedside in the end. I can still hear it when I think back on that night, not through speakers, not from any device, just that faint, impossible song, carrying a patient from this world to the next. My name's Maya. I've been a nurse on long-term care units for 12 years. You learn the rhythms of a place like that, the way light hits the floors at shift change, which patient sleeps with the TV on low, who likes their curtains open. You also learn the little rituals the building develops on its own. A walker always leaning by a door, a vase that never stays straight, a chair that seems to find its way back to the same place. This is about one of those chairs. We called it Room 7's window chair because that's where it always ended up, turned to face the window, no matter how many times anyone pushed it back into the conversation area or tucked it at the foot of the bed. It was just a plain institutional armchair, vinyl cracked at the seams, the kind you'd expect to find in a waiting room. Nothing special. Yet for months that chair had a habit of returning to the same position, like it had some stubborn magnet glued to the sill. When I first noticed it, I laughed it off. Chairs move, families sit, staff reposition furniture to make room for equipment, housekeeping nudges things while they clean. But then the pattern started to feel deliberate. I'd straighten the room between patients, push everything into sensible order, TV off, tray tables aligned, and by the next morning that chair would be directly facing the window, even if the curtains were closed. We mentioned it in passing at report. "That chair again," someone would say, and it would always get a half grin and a shrug. Nobody believed in spooky chairs. We were practical people with practical problems, pressure ulcers, meds, wound care. But there was a quietly persistent little discomfort around that chair, the kind that sits in your chest like a pebble. One late afternoon I was doing rounds. It had been a busy day, med passes, family calls, a transfer in from the hospital. The sky outside was bruised with rain, the kind of steady, soft weather that makes everyone draw inward. I went into room 7 to check vitals and chart, and there it was, exactly where it always ended up. The chair turned toward the window, curtains half parted so just a strip of gray light spilled across the linoleum. Mrs. H was asleep, her breathing shallow and even. Her daughter had been at the bedside earlier but had left for the night. The room felt quiet in a way that's different from normal rest, too still, like the building itself was holding its breath. I straightened the blanket, checked the oxygen, and did my usual bedside talk. "I'll be right down the hall if you need anything." She didn't stir. On an impulse, I don't know why, I pulled the chair close, sat down, and folded my hands in my lap. Sometimes you do that when you're waiting for a call light to clear, just to rest your legs. I set my chart on the arm and listened to the small noises of the unit. A distant cart squeak, the muffled television 2 doors down, the beeping of a med pump. The rain against the window made a soft, steady rhythm. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, I began to feel the sensation, the odd, prickly awareness that someone was behind me. Not in the room, not physical, more like a pressure, a sense of being observed. It was the kind of feeling you get when you've walked into a conversation and you didn't realize half the people there already knew one another. I turned my head instinctively, slow and careful, like you do when waking someone, half expecting to see a family member or perhaps a night aide who'd slipped in to tidy. No one was there. The bed was empty of relatives, the bathroom was closed, the hallway beyond the open door had the usual night shadows, but no one stood in them. The window showed the wet parking lot and the silhouette of a tree, leaves trembling in the rain. Nothing, just my own reflection and the shape of the chair behind me. I laughed, a little too loudly, and told myself I'd been staring at the screen too long. Stress does strange things. Night shifts do stranger ones. I left the chair as it was and went back to charting at the station. The unit moved through its evening routine. We dimmed lights, checked meds, answered a call light here and there. At 2 a.m., the night quiet settles into a different quality. People's voices are lower, machines more conspicuous. Sometime after 3, the evening aide Jenna came by with a fresh pot of coffee and the kind of weary smile you learn to appreciate. I mentioned the chair, casual, because we always joked about it. She grew quiet. "You sat in it?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. Felt weird, like someone watching from behind. She nodded slowly. "I sat in it once," she said. "Couldn't stay. Felt like someone was leaning over my shoulder." I told her I'd felt the same, and we both shrugged it off in the way people do, acknowledging an oddity without giving it weight. Healthcare makes you pragmatic. There's no time for superstition when you've got meds to pass and pressure sores to check. That night, no one moved the chair. It stayed where it always did, facing the window, curtains a thin slash of light. Morning report came with the same mechanical efficiency as always. Meds documented, vitals trended, the transfer list. I was exhausted. I headed to room 7 to check on Mrs. H and to hand over to the day shift nurse. The door opened, and I stepped into the room. The bed was empty. At first I thought she'd been taken down for a test. Someone had wheeled her out early, but then I saw it. The chair by the window, the vinyl darkened in the seat, and along the back, damp with sweat. No one had been in the room since the previous evening. The daughter had not returned. Housekeeping argued they hadn't been in there. Charting logs confirmed no transfers or interventions were logged overnight. The bed was untouched, the linens still folded where we'd left them. But the chair had been sat in, and whoever sat there had been sweating enough to leave the cushion damp. We did the reasonable, clinical things first. I checked the security footage for the hall. Nothing. I asked the night staff if anyone had been in to check on the room. No. We checked the logbook, called the daughter, who confirmed she hadn't been back. The whatever it was had left no footprints, no fingerprints, no explanation. The day nurse Tom joked that maybe it was just humidity, or a leaky heater. We wanted to believe that. People want explanations because explanations make the world safe. But I kept replaying the feeling from the night before, the sense of being watched from behind, while sitting in that chair. The dampness on the vinyl was a small physical proof that someone, or something had occupied that seat long enough to sweat. It was the kind of detail you could file away as an oddity, or keep tucked somewhere less tidy, where the mind revisits it late at night. Mrs. H was stable that day. She ate a little, the daughter came at noon, and the unit resumed its regular rhythm. But the chair kept pulling at the edges of my attention. Staff would glance at it, then away. We talk about odd things in nursing. The way some patients call out names no one in the room knows. The way an old man will start humming a lullaby and then stop breathing. We chalk things up to age, to medications, to oxygen deprivation. Those explanations are necessary and often true. And yet, some things don't fit neatly into the categories we use. Patients pass, machines beep, charts close. But small, persistent anomalies, the chair always turned, the sweat mark in the morning, linger in the corners of memory. I never sat in that chair again. Not because I was afraid, exactly. Fear is a clear, useful emotion. This was something wetter and less defined, a respect maybe for the fact that some rooms in that building collect history like dust. There are faces that seem to stay a little longer in the spaces that loved ones once warmed. I started to straighten it when I had to move a stool, but I always found myself angling it back toward the window before I left. People who watch our videos ask whether hospitals are haunted. I don't have a clean answer. I can tell you this, I've worked with people who die with no family in the room, and sometimes the building seems to make a small quiet arrangement for them, a chair turned toward the light,
a blanket folded over the foot of the bed, a clock that keeps the same exact minute as if to mark the moment. Maybe the chair faced the window because someone preferred to watch the weather. Maybe someone needed to be with Mrs. H in a way we couldn't be. Maybe the dampness was from the night aide who slipped in and sat briefly before leaving. Those are reasonable possibilities, and they are probably true in many cases. But every time I walk by room 7 and see that chair, I feel that little prickle at the back of my neck like a memory that hasn't finished its sentence. I think of the nights when buildings hold their breath, and of the ways people living or otherwise find small spaces to sit and watch, and I think quietly that some of us would rather face the window than the room, to look outward as the light changes, even if only for a little while.
Midnight rounds are the part of the job that teaches you patience, quiet checks, gentle reassurances, making sure each person is still where they should be. You learn to trust the rhythm of a ward, the soft hiss of oxygen, the distant sluice of a cart, the way monitors breathe in their steady beeps. It's when that rhythm breaks that the hair on your arm stands up. This happened on a night shift I'll never forget. It was one of those warm summer nights where the building feels a little sticky. The HVAC loses the battle and the corridor lights throw yellow pools across the linoleum. We were short-staffed, one of those we'll manage kind of nights, so I volunteered to run extra rounds just to make sure nothing slipped through. I like doing rounds alone. It's quiet, almost meditative. I walk the unit bed to bed, check lines and tubing, glance at monitors, touch foreheads for temperature, make sure the call lights are within reach. Most nights that's all it is, routine and the small kindnesses that keep people safe. At roughly 1:15 a.m., I made my usual loop. Room 312 was a new admission from the ER, a man in his late 50s, post-op observation for a minor bowel resection. He'd been stable all evening, a little drowsy from pain meds, but breathing fine and talking when oriented. He was labeled a moderate fall risk. We'd put the bed alarm on, left the rails up at 2, documented his status, and told his wife she could step out for a coffee if she needed. The chart looked ordinary. Vitals within limits, IV patent, intake recorded. Nothing that screamed, "Watch me." I opened the door, knocked my knuckles on the frame the way we do. A second of presence before a sleeping patient is disturbed, and pushed the door in. The bed was empty. Not one of those he's rolled to the side empties. The sheets were rumpled like someone had just sat up, the pillow depressed in the middle. The call light was on. The bed alarm had not sounded. The IV pump was still running, its tubing looped neatly over the side and clipped where it should be. The monitor's last recorded heartbeat was steady. The strip on the screen still scrolled like nothing had happened. He wasn't on the bathroom floor. He wasn't behind the curtain. There was simply a vacant human-shaped dent in the mattress. My stomach dropped. In 12 years, I've seen beds empty for all kinds of reasons. A patient wheeled to radiology. Someone ambulatory heading to the bathroom. A family member unexpectedly stopping in. But those situations are logged, somebody tells us. There's always a paper trail. This had none. I called out his name softly at first, then louder when silence answered me back. "Mr. Alvarez, it's Rachel, the nurse, are you okay?" No answer. Adrenaline does strange things. Logic tries to keep up while your body moves faster than your thoughts. I did the checklist we train into our bones. I scanned the room for signs, shoe prints, dragged blankets, tubing stretched across the floor. The bed rails were still partially up, just as we'd left them. The IV pole stood in place with the bag half full. The pump alarm was quiet. Everything looked like someone had stood up and walked away cleanly. I hit the emergency button by the door, the one that notifies the charge nurse and security simultaneously. That's a protocol when a patient is missing from their bed, especially one with an IV and on monitoring. I paged overhead so the rest of the unit would be alert. "Missing patient, room 3112, I said with as much calm as I could force into my voice. While I did that, I ran the hall down to the nurse's station to check the electronic health record timestamps, the medication administration record. No transfers were logged. No transport orders. I asked the unit secretary to pull the hallway camera footage for the corridor outside 3112. Sometimes people wander cluelessly, and footage clears it up. The secretary's face went from professional curiosity to something tighter. She told me the cameras showed no one passing 3112's doorway in the last 20 minutes. By now security was on the radio, and 2 techs were sweeping the unit stairs, stairwell landings, the exterior exit doors, the utility closets. One of the techs checked the rooftop access. Another searched employee break areas. I ran down the list in my head of what it would mean if he had actually left. Line still attached. IV pole precariously dragging, dangerous, yes, but possible in a delirious patient who's disconnected himself. It was terrifying to picture. 15 minutes later, which felt like a lifetime, the hall door creaked open and he was back in bed. He wasn't wheeled in. He wasn't coughing or disoriented, at least not outwardly. He was at the foot of the bed when I saw him, hunched as if he'd just sat down, hands folded in his lap, breathing the same shallow breaths he'd had an hour earlier. The IV tubing was still connected to his arm, the pump still in its bracket. The monitor never dropped a beat on the strip. There was not a single kink in the tubing, no evidence of a struggle, no blood, nothing to explain the disappearance. My heart was racing. The security tech who'd been scouring the stairwell stopped and stared. "Where did you go?" he asked, blunt, exhausted from running steps. The patient blinked slowly, like someone woken too quickly from a nap. "I don't remember," he said. "I was out. I was walking. I walked down the hall. I thought I left to get air." His voice was small, confused, honest. He had no recollection of leaving the room or how he'd moved through the unit with an IV in place. "We did all the things you do in that situation, because documentation is how we prove safety was maintained. We checked the IV site for infiltration. We inspected the pump logs. We checked telemetry for any transient events. We called the physician to update him, and we notified the family. We filled out an incident report with precise times and signatures. Security did a secondary sweep and pulled the camera footage for every corridor on the floor. The cameras finally yielded a sparse, maddening truth. There was no clear visual of him leaving or returning. The hallway camera outside 312 showed an empty doorway. The footage from the stairwell didn't show anyone. The timestamps matched our panic. No evidence to explain his movement. The patient's vitals remained stable. He had no injuries, no IV disconnected, and when we asked again, he still had no memory. Sleepwalking is a real phenomenon, especially in older adults and those sedated or on narcotics. Delirium can make people wander. But the seamlessness of his return, the IV intact, the monitor unchanged, didn't fit the messy reality we'd expect from a patient who'd been ambulatory in the hall. Something about it felt too clean. You learn over the years to separate fear from facts. The facts were, the bed had been empty, security had been called, the patient returned within 15 minutes, there was no camera evidence of his leaving or returning. He had no memory. The fear was the rest. What that emptiness meant, how it had happened, why the universe had offered no explanation. That night, I sat with him for an extra hour after his meds, charting in the chair beside his bed because neither of us felt ready to sleep. He kept saying, "I don't remember going anywhere, I just remember standing." I listened while the building hummed, the monitors whispering their endless white noise. He fell asleep leaning against the headboard, exhausted. I documented the incident in the report, gave it the clinical language it needed, signed my name, and tried to make sense of it with my boots on the floor. There are patients who wander and forget. There are systems that fail and alarms that don't sound. There are nights when sleep deprivation makes you see patterns where there are none. We covered all of those bases. We tightened bed alarms, we moved him closer to the nurse's station, and we made sure his family understood what had happened. But I still think about the empty bed. I still feel the small cold rush that went through me when I first pulled the curtains back and saw a human-shaped absence. We did everything we could to make the night safer. We followed protocol, and we talked about what else we might do. And yet sometimes the hospital keeps its own secrets, the small unaccounted-for moments that don't fit neatly into the charts. I'll never know precisely where he went for those 15 minutes. I only know what it's like to see a bed empty where a life was supposed to be, and then to watch that life simply return as if nothing had happened. That's the kind of thing that stays with you. It hangs in the quiet between rounds, in the pauses when monitors click, in the small unease that makes you check the bed twice. My name's Anna. I've been an RN on this floor for 9 years. Mostly nights. Mostly the kind of steady, quiet shifts that teach you to listen to the building. You learn the rhythm, which rooms sigh at 2 in the morning, which monitor starts hiccuping right before dawn, which elevator seems to cough when it's tired. Most nights the hospital feels predictable. Sometimes, though, it doesn't. This is one of those nights. It was past 2 a.m., and the unit had that soft, half-sleep hush we all fall into. Dimmed lights, a few TV sets on mute, families dozing in recliners, monitors whispering their steady beeps. I was doing my rounds when the nurse's station monitor pinged, one of the building's security alerts. We have them tied into our system. Stairwell doors and some exterior exits are alarmed after hours. Usually it's nothing. Someone bumped a door, a delivery person slipped through, but the alert had a little extra weight to it that night, like a coin dropped into a quiet cup. I pulled up the video feed at the station, more out of professional curiosity than worry. The tiled screen came up, and there it was, a grainy view of Stairwell B. At Neuro 2 Free, the camera showed a tall, pale figure descending the steps, wrapped in what looked like a patient gown. The outline moved deliberately, one landing at a time, like someone moving with purpose down into the belly of the hospital. I felt my skin prickle. It's funny, after years of night shifts, your body gives you signals before your brain does. I hit the intercom for security and the charge nurse at the same time. "We've got a stairwell alarm," I said, my voice steady because we had to be professional. "There's something on camera. I'm going to check it, and I need a sweep of the adjoining floors." Security answered immediately and told me they were on their way. While I waited, I grabbed my flashlight and the handheld radio, small things, but familiar, and moved toward stairwell B. The corridor was a long green blur under fluorescent lights. My shoes made quiet, measured sounds on the linoleum. We tell ourselves, clinically, to stay calm. It helps when you have to coordinate people. The feed kept showing the descending figure. I watched it on my phone as I walked, the silhouette, the gown, the slow steps. It looked like a person. It looked like a patient. It did not look like anything that belonged in a stairwell at that hour. When I reached the stairwell door, I hesitated for half a second, long enough to catch my breath, and then pushed it open. The first thing that hit me was the cold. Stairwells always hold a different climate. The emergency lights threw a sterile green wash across the concrete, and they were empty. No gown catching on a railing, no shoe prints, no scrap of fabric. The stairs were clean, the landings clear. The echo swallowed my voice when I called down. "Hello? Security, are you there?" Silence answered. I checked each landing methodically. You do that by muscle memory. Scan left, sweep right, angle the flashlight into corners where someone might hide. I checked for obvious things. Someone who'd fallen and couldn't call. A coat left behind. A torn sleeve hooked on a bolt. Nothing. No signs of a person having been there at all. By the time security arrived, I'd already called telemetry and the neighbor units to see if any patient had been unaccounted for. We asked the ward clerks to pull a list of any patient with a gown missing, anybody who had eloped earlier in the evening. The response was always the same. No open elopements. No family signed checks out. No transport orders logged. Staff on the adjacent units confirmed everyone was in their rooms. The message came back, everyone is where they should be. Security and I retraced my steps up and down the stairs, floor by floor. We went through the service doors, the maintenance closets, the rooftop access, every place someone might have ducked in. We asked housekeeping, nursing assistants, anyone who might have needed to be in the stairwell. No one had been. The stairwell camera's timestamp matched the alert exactly, but physically, the space was empty. We pulled more footage. I sat with a security tech while we rewound the clip frame by frame. The figure appears, slow and solid, descending the stairs like any human being. A second later, the next frame shows empty steps. There's no footage of the figure stepping into an elevator or slipping through a door. It's as if the body dissolves between frames. Being a nurse makes you a practical person. I started cycling through explanations, camera artifact, reflection off a wet floor, light from a swing door, even a trick of infrared in the lens. We enhanced contrast, slowed the clip, adjusted brightness. The silhouette had a human shape, shoulders, a head bowed slightly, the way the gown hung. It moved like a person, not fabric caught in a draft. The footage didn't stutter. The timestamp flowed normally. We watched the loop until we were dizzy. We did the right things. We cleared the unit, contacted the floor managers, asked every nurse to check their patients. We walked the corridors, set up temporary watches at stairwell doors, and submitted the incident report. Nursing leadership asked me to write an objective account of what I'd seen and done. Security logged the alarm as unresolved. We closed the loop on the paperwork, because hospitals like closure on a sheet of paper, even when real closure is impossible. What I remember most isn't the footage or the empty stairs. It's the look on the night tech's face when our sweep turned up nothing. The way the unit seemed to breathe a little harder that night. I remember thinking, if a patient walked the stairs, they would leave a messy trail, rumpled gowns, scuffed shoes, something. People aren't ghosts, they're bodies that mark the world. The stairwell had none of those marks. That morning, whispers circled the break room. Some of the staff joked about the place being old and suggestive of memory. Others were quieter, the kind of silence that comes when routine cracks. We all have those stories we tuck away from the night shift. A song on a ventilator that stopped before it reached the end, a smell of cookies in an empty room, a family member who called to say goodbye from 2 states away, right as a patient took their last breath. We build up vocabulary for the unexplainable so we can continue to function. I don't use the word haunted. It's too loaded. Instead, I say this. Hospitals hold history. They hold people who have been loved and frightened and relieved and scared. There are corners where life has leaned longer than others. Sometimes the cameras catch those corners in a way you can't explain with protocol. Other times, they don't. Weeks later, I still pull up that clip sometimes, not because I want to be unsettled, but because I want an answer that fits into my daily logic. I want to tell myself a patient wandered down for fresh air and then returned, barefoot and sleepy, to bed. I want the stairwell to be ordinary, but the footage resists tidy answers. It shows a body where no body remains. We tightened watches and reminded staff to call if anything felt off. We walked our rounds more carefully, and at night, whenever the stairwell alarm pings, my stomach gives me that same little twist. I check the monitors, I look at the cameras, and I listen to the building's noises the way I listen to a patient's breathing, carefully, respectfully, trying to hear what's ordinary and what's not.
I can't tell you where that figure went. I can only tell you what it felt like to see evidence of someone stepping where there was no one, and then to stand in that real empty space and try to make sense of a night that wouldn't fit the logic we rely on. That's the part that lingers, the sense that the hospital remembers more than we can record, that some moments belong to the building as much as to the people inside it.
You learn to move with the hospital, how to time your rounds, how to read the tired rhythms of a ward, who sleeps with the TV low, who calls 3 times for the same blanket, which monitors like to chirp at 2 in the morning. You also learn to trust the scanner on your cart. It's a small plastic box and a little light, but when it beeps, it's the legal and practical heartbeat of every medication we give. If that beep doesn't happen, the system tells you in cold, exact language that something didn't happen. This is the night the scanner told me the truth, and the patient told me something else. It was a slow night, fewer admissions, a quiet head nurse, the kind of shift where the only drama comes from the popcorn in the vending machine. I was making my usual rounds at 10:30 p.m., med pass on my cart, MAR open on the workstation. Mr. Thompson, late 70s, CHF, on a tiny regimen of diuretics and a PRN sleep med, was assigned to me that evening. He'd been restless earlier, but after a small dose of lorazepam at the doctor's discretion, he'd settled. Tonight he seemed lucid when I checked earlier, talking about his childhood fishing trips and the way rain sounded on the porch at his old house. I pushed into his room with the cart, the scanner warm in my hand. He was propped up, eyes open, the glow of the monitor painting his face a pale blue. "Evening, Mr. T," I said, glancing at the MAR. "We'll do your night meds in a minute. Anything you need before I start?" He shook his head. "No, nurse. Thank you." I prepped the meds, pill cup, water, charting fingers already hovering. At this hospital, we scan everything. Wristband, med barcode, then the med itself, then the patient again. It's humiliation-proof and careful, 2 checks built into a third. I scanned his wristband, beep. I scanned the med packet, beep. I put the tablet on the tongue depressor, held it for him, and leaned in to scan the last barcode, the one that logs me as having given it to him. The scanner didn't beep. It flashed red for a heartbeat, then gave me a neutral tone. I tried again. Nothing. The handheld synced with the MAR on my workstation. I checked the screen. No green confirmation. No timestamp. My first thought was mechanical, flat battery, spotty connection. I tucked the scanner into my cart, grabbed the backup handheld, and scanned again. Still no log. "Mr. Thompson," I said, soft, more careful than I intended. "Did you just take your night meds?" He smiled at me, the way old men do when they want to be polite. "You just came by and gave them to me. You stood right here. You wore that blue scrub top like you always do, and you said, 'Sleep now, Mr. T.'" He mimicked my cadence perfectly. It made the hair on my neck stand up. He described my voice, the small slide in the second syllable, and the way I tucked the blanket up under his chin. He described my name badge color. He described the small scratch on the edge of the cart where someone had taped the schedule. He described the exact sequence of the 3 beeps he heard from the scanner when I gave him his meds. He described it so perfectly that for a moment I believed I had been there because the image he painted was mine, except the handheld showed no administration. The MAR was blank for that medication. The scanner history logged nothing at 10:30. I ran the device diagnostics there at bedside. Careful fingers that had to remain professional. Backup handheld, working. Network, fine. I checked the medication bin, ample stock, unopened packets except the one in my hand. I checked the camera outside the unit door later. No one else had been into the room during that minute. I ran through protocol in my head. Document, notify, verify. I documented the discrepancy in objective language, time, med, device check, battery status, because that's what we do first. Then more quietly, I asked him to tell me again what I looked like when I gave it. He repeated it without hesitation. He told me where I stood, where I set the cup, how I ticsed when he coughed. He used my nickname, the one a small group of patients borrowed because it made them feel safe. I felt my throat tighten. I asked him to describe anything else that felt different. He said, "You smelled like the hall, like hot coffee, and the vending machine, and you said it would be just a moment. You told me to sleep." The checklist in my brain kept insisting on practical possibilities. Sleepwalking, confusion from medications, delirium tremens, except he'd been lucid, oriented, and had no delirium on his chart earlier. People sometimes confabulate, especially at night. People sometimes believe the routine because the routine comforts them. I told myself that we were dealing with a memory distortion. I told myself this calmly as I reached for the second handheld, scanned his wristband again, and logged another dose properly, this time with a beep and a green confirmation. He closed his eyes after that, breathing shallow and even. I tucked the blanket under his chin like he'd said I did, because in the end, the patient's comfort comes first.
I wrote in the chart, medication given at 11:02 on second handheld after initial scan failed to log. I flagged it with the night charge. I handed off the note to the oncoming nurse when my shift ended. Device error, patient reports prior dose. The charge nurse agreed we'd run the device through full diagnostics in the morning and notify biomedical. Around 6:45 a.m. the call came. His daughter, on her way in for daytime visiting, called the station in a tremor. She'd been with him the previous evening but left at 9 p.m., she said, and he'd seemed fine. When she arrived this morning, the bed was quiet and his chest was still. We went in together, the daughter and I, because I'd been the one doing his nights and I'd carried the oddness with me. He died in his sleep. No code, no struggle. He just stopped breathing sometime in the night. We did the work we're trained to do. We documented time of death. We notified the physician. We called the family into the small waiting room and sat with them while they asked the questions no one can fully answer. We completed the necessary incident report forms. We ran the logs for the handhelds and the server again. Biomedical techs pulled the scanner apart and found no fault that would cause phantom confirmations to be logged in a patient's memory but not in the system. IT checked network packets. They were clean. In the morning huddle, someone asked, quietly, if the prior dose might have been given by an agency nurse or a night float who'd slipped in and not logged it. We checked staff sign-in. No one matched. The medication cabinet didn't show any open packages beyond the one I'd used and then scanned properly. Pharmacy verified inventory. There were no loose ends that led to an ordinary explanation. The thing that caught me, what I still carry, is the specificity of how he remembered me. The way my voice bent on that one syllable. The exact place I stood. The little scratch on my cart. It felt like a tiny lived memory of something that never happened. It was detailed in the way real memories are. Friction, texture, cadence. It felt real to him. And when the real thing, the machine, the chart, the server, didn't line up with the patient's memory, we were left with two truths that couldn't be reconciled. In nursing, we learn to be comfortable with uncertainty. We stabilize, we treat symptoms, we chart what we can verify, but we're human. The quiet parts of the night get into your bones. The spaces where logic and experience don't meet, make you pause. I still think about Mr. Thompson when the handheld doesn't beep on the first try. I still think about the way a patient's memory can be as authoritative to them as a chart is to me. I still wonder sometimes if there are moments that fold over themselves, if a kindness, a voice, a small human action can happen in a way that leaves no record but still leaves an impression. I can't explain it. I can only tell you what I saw, what I scanned, what the machine confirmed, and what he insisted had happened in full color, as real as anything I've ever done at a bedside. That's the work we carry. We hold the charts, the beeps and the stories together, even when they don't quite fit.
The cry came from the middle of the nursery, clear as day, and every crib was empty. My name's Jenna. I've been a labor and delivery RN for 11 years, and I can tell you the sound of a newborn crying in the night is as familiar to me as my own name. It's a sound that demands attention, urgent, small, impossible to ignore. We train for that sound, we respond to it reflexively. So when a cry shows up and there's no baby to answer it, your hands go cold before your head catches up. It started on a Wednesday, a night shift that should have been ordinary. We had a full house, moms in recovery, a couple of new dads dozing in recliners, the nursery under a low, respectful light for those of us who keep infants for a few hours for observation. Night shifts on maternity are a balance of vigilance and tenderness, checking vitals, charting feeds, making sure everyone's badge and ID bands are matched and secure. The nursery is supposed to be the simplest checklist we do. Count the bassinets, confirm the bracelets, log the babies under surveillance. We expect nothing strange. At 2:12 a.m., I was finishing a med pass when I heard it, the first cry. It was faint, like someone had pressed a music box into the next room and turned the volume down. It carried over the hum of the heating and the distant hush of the hall. I looked up automatically. Babies cry, that's not unusual. But when I stepped into the nursery and glanced at the bank of bassinets lined up under the soft light, every blanket lay smooth over the newborns' chests. The monitors were the only things moving, little bellows under the clear plastic, the occasional hand that flexed like a tiny wave. "Did you hear that?" I asked the night tech, who was wiping down the warmer. She frowned and nodded. "Yeah, thought someone must have brought one in for a feed." We did a quick visual sweep, bib changes, diaper checks, the usual, and everything seemed fine. Still, the sound felt like a direct appeal. I walked to the window between the nursery and nurse's station and checked the log. All infants accounted for, all bracelets matched, all doors secure. I radioed the charge nurse to verify the sign-in sheet at the front desk. No transfers logged, no claims of a missing infant. The mother rooms were all closed, mothers sleeping or charting. There was no reason for a random cry. Over the next 10 minutes, it happened again. A soft, keening cry that rose and fell like someone practicing the exact pitch of distress. It seemed to move too. 1 second it felt like it came from the warmer, the next it seemed closer to room 4, then behind me by the supply cabinet. Every time we ran to the source, it receded, the way a tide withdraws. The tech and I checked the monitors, the apnea alarms, the feed schedules, and even the intercoms. Nothing to trigger a sound that would be audible in the hall. The charge nurse called security. That escalates things quickly. When you call security on a maternity floor, it's not a decision you make lightly. Infants are vulnerable, and the possibility of an unaccounted-for voice in the night changes the tenor of the whole place. Security arrived with the clipped, efficient energy they always move with. 2 guards, flashlights, the kind of calm people look for when things feel off. They began a sweep. The nursery, every patient room, the corridors, the stairwells, the loading docks. They asked the clerks to pull visitor logs and badge scans. They phoned the front desk to confirm no one had checked in. We stayed with the babies. Mothers were roused gently, told there had been a noise and that we were checking. Some just rolled over, others sat up, eyes raw, and listened with us. The sound, when it came, threaded around our boots and under the cupboards like a memory. Security moved methodically, radios chattering as they cleared hallways. I remember standing by an isolette, the tiny fingers inside curled, and every now and then I'd hear that cry as if from over my shoulder. An hour later, there was still no explanation. Security had canvassed the floor above and below us, checked the parking garage, and even walked the rooftop, because you have to be exhaustive. They pulled footage from the hallway cameras. There was footage of empty corridors, of a cleaner pushing a cart in the east wing around 2:08, of a nurse crossing at 2:14 with a cup of coffee. The cameras showed no human source stepping into the nursery space or out of it. The logbook at the front desk showed no badge entries. Every infant was still in their assigned bassinet. Every bracelet matched the chart. Yet the sound had followed security the way a scent buds onto the air. Where they went, it seemed to go, leading them down a corridor and stopping an instant before they reached the door. Watching the guards search, I realized something else. The cry wasn't always the same. Sometimes it had the thinness of a baby who'd just woken hungry. Other times it had the quick, short bursts like a new muscle learning to yell. There was an uncanny mimicry to it, like a stranger who'd learned the language of our unit by listening. The techs began to exchange looks at the nurse's station, small, helpless smiles that mean this is weird without the hysteria. We ran every clinical check we could imagine. We checked for a PA interruption, did the audio wiring rounds, looked for a phone left on in a parent's locker, even turned off and reloaded the nursery speaker system. We checked the newborn hearing screens. No bells, no tone artifact. We consulted our neonatal nurse practitioner on call. She suggested delirium or an echo, but also admitted the human part of the job knows when something doesn't add up. By the second hour, the nursery had become a magnet. Mothers clustered at the window, white-faced. The unit manager offered coffee and calm phrases. Security moved with a professional patience that felt thin when pushed through fear. Yet the sound, blurry, always just beyond the place we could verify, persisted. At one point it traveled down the hall and seemed to nest in the doorway of a mother whose infant had been discharged that afternoon. She and her husband sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped, and said they'd heard it too, like a tiny throat clearing from the next apartment over. It stopped suddenly at 3:25 a.m. No big finale, no last keening. It just faded like someone turning a radio dial. The relief was near physical. People exhaled and laughed a little, embarrassed by the tightness of their chests. Security filed the incident as unresolved, and the video logs, while thorough, offered no new leads. We documented it meticulously. Times, witnesses, camera screenshots, who called whom, because in healthcare you document anomalies the same way you document meds. You can't fix what you can't prove, but you can build a record. What lingered for me wasn't the fear so much as the way the sound behaved like an attention seeker. It arrived when the night was quietest, when the humidity made the plastic of the bassinets smell faintly of soap. It moved in a pattern that suggested a knowledge of our routines when shift change happened, where a nurse might be sitting. It felt deliberate in a way that didn't match any accidental audio bleed I'd ever heard. I began to wonder if it was less about the babies and more about the space, the nursery itself keeping score of nights, of births, of those first frantic breaths. Over the following weeks, staff swore they heard it again on occasion, small occurrences, quiet and quickly dismissed. A tech who worked nights said she sometimes hears a lullaby, low enough to be mistaken for an air vent. Another nurse told me she once heard it while charting in an empty break room, the sound a distant cradling of a bottle that wasn't there. We started almost jokingly to leave a chair by the nursery window, not because we expected an answer, but because people wanted to have a place to go when the sound came. Hospitals are made of rituals. A chair helps make an uncomfortable experience manageable. The mothers inevitably had their own language for it. Some crossed themselves and prayed quietly, grateful that if something was out there, it was gentle. Others grew anxious and demanded extra checks, insistently asking for another staff member in the room at night. We accommodated both, because in a unit where love and fear are always close neighbors, small gestures count. I don't have a tidy explanation. In 11 years I've chalked many things up to equipment quirks, exhausted imaginations, and the strange acoustics of concrete buildings. But every so often,
When I pass the nursery window on a quiet night, and the light is low and the air smells faintly of baby powder, I think about that hour we spent listening for a cry that nobody could place. I think about how sound can attach itself to people and places and follow you like a shadow. I think about the thin line we walked between science and story in the middle of the night. Whatever it was, electronics, echoes, something else, no infant was harmed, and every bracelet matched every chart. The log remained clean, but the memory of that cry lives in the unit the way a melody lives in your head after the radio goes off. It's there in the quiet, and sometimes it makes you stand still and listen, just in case.
I've been an RN on MedSurg for 11 years, mostly nights the last 5. So I know the small rhythms of a hospital, the way a curtain smells after a deep clean, the particular creak of the supply cart, the exact cadence of a sleeping monitor. You learn how to move through other people's private hours without breaking them. That night the hospital broke a little in a way I couldn't stitch back together. It was after midnight and the unit had settled into that thin hush where everything sounds like it's underwater. 2 patients shared a semi-private room down the east wing. Mr. Ellis in the window bed, post-op and tired, and Mrs. Green in the curtain side, on telemetry for atrial fib. The divider curtain between them was that standard heavy pleated fabric we use, almost institutional velvet, hanging from a metal track with those small plastic rollers. You tug it closed for privacy, and it clicks into place. It's 100 tiny rituals. Draw the curtain, set the call light in reach, fold the blanket so it doesn't catch on the rail. Little things that make people feel dignified when they're at their most vulnerable. I'd just finished giving IV antibiotics 2 doors down and was heading back to chart when I heard it, a sharp, ripping sound that made me freeze mid-step. It was the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a hospital, too violent, too instantaneous. My heart kicked up. I ran. Both patients were screaming the moment I pushed the curtain aside. They were on their sides, faces contorted, voices high and raw. "A man, he just walked through," Mr. Ellis kept saying between breaths. "He went right past my bed," Mrs. Green cried, "and he didn't touch the floor, he just went." Their eyes were wide and wet, pupils blown by shock and something else I couldn't name. The curtain hung open in a ragged arc. The fabric was flared as if something had pulled it with force. At first I thought the track must have sheared, that some roller had popped and the curtain had come down in a sweep. But the track looked intact. The runners sat in the metal rail like they always did. I checked the snaps and the hem for a tear. There was a triangular stretch in the fabric where it had been yanked, threads pulled tight, yet the hooks were all present and the rail hadn't been disturbed. The curtain looked as if someone had grabbed an edge mid-air and ripped it open with a velocity that should have left the hardware scarred, but the hardware was unexpectedly polite and unharmed. My training kicked in automatically. Calm voice, paper and pen, quick tasks. I leaned in close to each patient, took their vitals, hands steady so they wouldn't feel my shaking. Pulse and BP were elevated across the board, respirations shallow. I soothed them the way we do, the small scripts we give to frightened people. "You're safe. I'm right here. I'll check everything." I checked the room, window latched, door closed and locked. No one in the bathroom, no footprints on the linoleum. The IV pumps ticked. The monitor strips rolled on. Nothing out of place except that curtain and the frantic tremor in both their voices. I paged the charge nurse and called security. While I spoke into the phone, I kept scanning the room for an ordinary answer. A prank, a loose vent, a piece of equipment that could have snagged the fabric. The curtain's hem had a dust mark on the side that faced Mrs. Green like it had brushed against something. But there was no blood, no scuff, no mark on the floor to show where a foot might have pushed off. If a person had dragged that curtain open, the curtain track would have reverberated. The metal would have shown a scrape. There was nothing. Security arrived in 10 minutes, faster than usual, and we went through the checklist. We pulled cameras for the corridor outside the door. Nothing. We walked every floor above and below. We checked the stairwell that feeds the east wing entrance, the utility closet, the staff break room. No one matching the patient's descriptions, and no one pulled up on the footage, exiting or entering the room. The hallway cameras were grainy, but they were not magical. They captured boots and coats. They captured nothing that corresponded to the moment we heard the tear. Both patients insisted the same thing. They described a man mid-30s, dark jacket, pale face. They said he smiled without showing teeth. They said he moved with a kind of gliding ease, like he didn't need the floor. They described my scrubs, my apron, my scent, as if they'd seen me but not me. They described the sound of the curtain being pulled aside, the exact same sharp wordless sliver of noise I'd heard, then nothing at all, just the echo. Their accounts matched in the strange way that meant more than coincidence. 2 independent witnesses with the same edges to a memory. We took statements. I wrote in objective language what I had observed. Curtain opened, track intact, no sign of forced entry. Both patients alert but distressed, no camera evidence. We documented the time, the staff who were present, the steps we took. That paperwork is its own kind of liturgy. Measure, box, sign. It gives shape to chaos. We did the practical things too, checked telemetry, reviewed medication lists, some drugs can cause hallucinations, delirium, and asked the night pharmacist to verify nothing had been given that could explain a shared perceptual event. Meds were as charted, labs were within the lines where they'd been earlier, but paperwork and protocols didn't soothe the way either patient kept glancing over her shoulder all night like someone might slip in through the doorway and take the open air. They kept saying the same line, "He walked through," and then they'd look at me, as if waiting for an answer I had no license to give. When the day team came on, the unit manager and the risk nurse did a second sweep. They tugged at the curtain themselves, making sure it was anchored, noting the lack of mechanical damage to the rail. Maintenance came and took the rail down to run it across a bench. Look for stress, for a hairline fracture or a burr that might snag fabric and then let it fly. There was none. It behaved like a normal rail. The maintenance tech shrugged and said, "You get a bad seam or a faulty clip, you'll see it. This isn't that." They logged the event as unexplained force applied to divider curtain. That dry phrase felt like a bandage over a wound. Words scattered through the unit like light. Some staff laughed it off. Drafts, a prank, a curious imagination squeezed by stress. Others walked the room with the small wariness of people who had learned to respect the night. Patients asked for extra blankets. Visitors lingered longer. We installed a temporary alarm on the curtain track for a few nights. If the curtain moved, we'd know immediately. The alarm never tripped after that. Perhaps the trouble had been a one-off, or perhaps whatever it was didn't like an audience of blinking lights and wired attention. I keep replaying the moment in my head, the sound itself snapping into place like a camera flash. The curtain had the shape of a person's movement caught mid-gesture, flared, and then still. Two patients had the same frightened certainty that a man had walked between them, past the window bed, and into the half-shadow of the curtain side. Yet no one appeared in footage, no one left prints, no hardware showed abuse. The simplest explanation, wind, prank, mechanical failure, felt like trying to pin a weather vane to a cloud. What stays with me is the human residue, the way Mr. Ellis's chin trembled, the way Mrs. Green clutched the sheet and repeated the same sentence like a prayer. We did our jobs, we checked, we documented, we comforted, we made lists of what to change, more frequent safety sweeps, a check of the rail hardware every week, a package of new curtains on order. Those are the things we can do. We can't, and we shouldn't, provide spiritual answers on a hospital form. At the nurse's handoff that morning, everyone had the same tired look, the kind that comes from a night that refuses to be properly cleared. You learn to carry these things with professional distance, but they collect anyway. They live in the margin, a glance over the shoulder, a softer voice in a dim room, a curtain drawn a little more closely. Sometimes, late on a quiet shift when the hallway hums low and the world feels thin, I will pass by that semi-private room and tug the curtain closed more gently than I need to, as if the fabric itself might be holding the memory of whatever passed through. I don't have a tidy ending for you. No camera magic revealed a hooded figure. No maintenance report found a mechanical flaw. Only two people who swore, in the absence of evidence, that a man had walked between them and gone. In a place designed to make fragile things visible, that night we all learned how little we can actually see. Hey, a huge thank you to every viewer and subscriber who's been on this channel's strange, quiet ride. Your support means everything. If you're new, welcome. Please subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss future stories, and give the video a like if it gave you chills. I want to hear from you. Share your own unsettling moments or any weird encounters in the comments and say what state you're watching from. I read every comment and I'll pin the best stories. Stay safe, keep your flashlight handy, and I'll see you in the next video.